Welcome to the Songwriter Theory Podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Vidala, and we're going to talk about music theory, lyric writing, creative productivity, inspiration, and more. I'm super excited to have you here, so let's dive into the episode. Hey friend. So on this podcast, we are celebrating number 20, which is pretty exciting. Doesn't feel like I've done 20 of these already. I guess technically I've done 19, but I want to thank you guys for all sticking with me through this time, and hopefully I can keep delivering better and better content over time. And if you've been here since episode 1, special thank you to you. That's 20 episodes where you've dealt with me, and that's pretty cool. So I realized recently that I hadn't done much on arranging, and arranging was one of the main categories I wanted to do. And so we're going to talk about arranging today. Also, because I did notice, for some reason I thought, I'll do less stuff on arranging because it seemed like the interest level in it wasn't as high, but I re-looked at some of the podcast stats and realized that it does seem like people definitely, I think it was number 3 for downloads or something, the previous arranging one that I did. So here's another one. I personally love arranging. I think it's just fascinating. It's almost like songwriting part 2, sort of. It's different, but it's similarly creative and yet so very different. And it's really exciting, and it adds like this new level of excitement to sort of the songwriting process. And so that being said, we're going to go over 5 really important questions that I think there are to ask when you're arranging. And with this, I'm hoping to give some pretty good clarity on what it is. If you're kind of in a state of I don't even know how to begin with arranging, this should answer a decent amount of those questions. Now, I will say that number one necessary thing to know when it comes to arranging is music theory. So, and there's plenty of podcasts, and I'm about to make a new free guide, also on music theory, and so between those previous posts and then the guide that I'm making right now, that's going to be super awesome and super helpful. Between those two, I would go back and look at that because it's really important to understand specifically keys. Understanding keys is very important for this. So definitely be sure to do that. And besides that, we're going to dive right in. So first question is, why is this instrument the right choice? So this begins really with even what I like to call the main instrument. So sometimes, for me personally, when I'm mixing, because for me, in the process, just to boil it down real quick, usually my process is more or less, this whole songwriting stage is a whole mix of maybe I sat at the piano and came up with a melody I liked and did something with it, and then wrote lyrics and eventually had a whole chord progression and then figured out a different part. Or maybe I wrote a whole lyric first and then eventually found the right music for it. Or maybe I came up with a piano part that I really liked and then I figured out a melody over it. Or maybe I, found a guitar chord progression I liked, and then so regardless of all that, that's kind of its own stage. And then when I start recording, I'll start with what I call the main instrument, which is whichever instrument I wrote the song on. And then from there, I sort of do the arranging. So I record that main instrument, which is what I wrote the song on, and then from there, I do the rest of the arranging. So for this, the important takeaway from that is main instrument. So main instrument to me is that instrument that is the heart of the song, that regardless of whether you're in a band or what your situation is, this is the instrument that if you were to play it acoustically, you would go out and play. So if you would sit at the piano and sing, if it was an acoustic show, then that's, in my mind, probably the main instrument. If it was an acoustic guitar, that's probably the main instrument. If the song doesn't quite feel right, if it's not electric guitars, power chords, then that's probably the main instrument. So there's a little more nuance to it than just what you would play acoustically, because the main instrument is not necessarily acoustic. But that's a good way to sort of figure out what that is. And it's important to figure out what instrument as that main instrument is the right choice. And often the right choice is what you wrote it on, because if you wrote it on piano, it's probably meant to be a piano part because you wrote it as a piano part, and it sounds good that way because that's how you wrote it, and that's how it sounded good to you, which is why you made a whole song off of it. But sometimes it's definitely worth checking out, like, okay, but what if I tried this part on acoustic guitar? Or what if I come up with an acoustic guitar part that goes with it that I actually like better than the piano part? Or, it can be other instruments too, but for the most part, most of our songs are probably going to have main instrument of a guitar or a piano. A violin, if you're going to sing vocals with it, is probably not going to be the main instrument. It certainly may be in there, but it's rarely the main instrument. And drums and bass are almost always sort of backup singers, if you will. But then, besides that main instrument, you have to be intentional about the instrumentation in general. A harmonica and a flute playing the same part will have a very different feel. And you have to be cognizant of that when you're choosing what to do. You can't just be like, well, here's the guitar part, so I guess the piano part's next. Well, pause. Is it really a piano part that's needed here? Maybe it should be a synth part. Maybe it needs to be another acoustic guitar part. Maybe it needs to be an electric guitar part. Maybe it needs to be a violin or a flute or harmonica. So it's important to sort of figure out what is the right choice for some of these instruments, and do not feel compelled like, oh, I need to have bass guitar in this song. Do you? You don't necessarily need that. You don't necessarily need electric guitar. You don't necessarily need a piano. And that's true of anything, even drums, right? Like we sort of think of drums as the thing we take for granted, like, oh, it's just there. Well, maybe just a heartbeat style kick drum where it's just kind of that constant, which that probably sounds really obnoxious in the microphone, but when it's just that sort of heartbeat, every downbeat kick drum, and you don't even need the rest of the kit. Or maybe you'd use a cajon or some other rhythm instrument for, maybe triangle. First of all, why? But, whatever. It's up to you. If you want just the triangle for it, that's fine. So take nothing for granted and always ask yourself, is this instrument really the right choice? Because sometimes, a cajon, for example, might be really good with a sort of mellow acoustic song because it's less aggressive than a drum kit usually. And that's going to be true with so many instruments. And it's just important to ask that question. Why is this instrument for this part I'm working on? Why is this instrument the right choice? And don't be afraid to change that choice later down the road if you realize, maybe this other thing would be better. Don't be afraid to do that. Second question, what is the job of this part? Now some of this is where it's going to get really important. So you can't have too many stars. So I'm going to give you a couple analogies here. So first of all, if you're a sports person, you've probably seen throughout your years super teams. And super teams, for those who might not be into sports, and I feel it's straightforward, but just to make sure, a super team is usually the concept of like a bunch of stars get together on one team, and it's just like, well, this team is has talent way higher than any other team around us. Like the Golden State Warriors recently would be an example of that, where it's like, 3 of the best 6-7 players in the league are all on one team, which is a little ridiculous when there's only 5 guys on the court at any time in basketball. So very often in sports, it's known that like super teams don't necessarily work. And there's a reason for that. It's because there's too many stars, too many people that they want their hands on the ball. But, there's only so much time in a game. There's only so many shots to take. And not everybody can be the star. And often stars also are sort of that type A personality or just some other type of personality that sort of wants the glory or whatever. And, when you're the star of a team, you can shine and it'd be great. But sometimes if, there's 3 stars or even 2 stars on a team, like when Kobe and Shaq were together, that didn't end well at all. It's sort of a battle between the two. And then it doesn't work out and the team breaks apart. And it's sort of the same thing with, when those movie trailers come out and it's star-studded. It's just one star after the other. And at the end of the trailer, that's usually when they show like the list of 10 names that you're like, you love and recognize all of these names. And I don't know about you, but for me, when I see that, I'm like, oh, so it's going to be a terrible movie. And they're trying to like make up for it with a star-studded cast. Or they just all feel sort of disappointing. Like, oh, well, okay. This had this big shot star, but he had 5 minutes of screen time. So whatever. So both of those are sort of an example of what I'm talking about here with like, every part has a job and not every part can be the star. It just can't. You can't have like 5 lead guitars that all star. You know what I mean? Like a person can only pay attention to so many things. So if there's a vocal going on, realistically, there's maybe 1 or 2 other parts that can star, in quotes, at the same time. So, the listener's not going to be like, oh, dude, what a great bass part, and be humming along to the bass part while they're also listening to the vocal melody, while they're also, moving their arm to the piano part, while they're also, I don't know, whistling somehow at the same time the lead guitar. You know what I mean? Like there's only so many things that can fill that lead role, that star role. So you need to understand that not every part is meant to fit that. And that's fine. That's good. We need things to fill the background. We need things to star. We need things to sort of sit in that middle ground where it's really filling in the mix. It's not necessarily way in the background, but it's also not the star of the show. And I mean, really, drums and bass are sort of the epitome of that, right? Like, unless you're a bass player, you probably don't notice the bass part in a song. But guess what? If we took the bass part out, you would definitely notice. You'd be like, oh, something's missing. What is wrong with this? It just doesn't sound full. It doesn't sound that good. And that was because we took away the bass. But guess what? It wasn't being the star. It was just doing its job. And its job, usually, I mean, obviously there are exceptions. There are some sweet bass lines out there that, are maybe even the main... they're almost the main hook of the song, but besides those, most songs or a lot of songs, the bass is sort of just there and it fills in the mix, and it's important. Like it's not that part isn't important. It's just not a star. Like in football, right? Like, sorry for the sports analogy again, but for football, nobody is excited when you draft an offensive lineman in the first round of the draft. They're just not. They're like, oh, a big guy that blocks for the quarterback. Big whoop. Right? But everybody's stoked when you get a running back because that's flashy. You're going to see him and he's going to run for 5 yards and you're going to be like, yeah, what a running back. Or a wide receiver because he's tall and he's going to catch balls in an incredible way and get touchdowns. And, quarterback goes without saying, and corners get a lot of credit and pass rushers do because they get sacks. But like, nobody appreciates the offensive lineman because when he's doing his job, you don't notice anything, right? Like when the offensive tackle is doing his job, you just the quarterback gets to do his job and everything just goes smoothly. But you don't notice that. You only notice when he doesn't do his job and the quarterback gets sacked. And that's kind of exactly what I'm talking about here, where like it's not important for that person to be a star. It's important for that person to do their job, and that doesn't have any bearing on how important they are. Because you could easily argue that an offensive line is more important than, wide receivers, or like very much could argue those things, but they're not the star. So star and importance are two very different things. So don't think that I'm saying like, oh, well, this instrument needs to star and everything's less important. No. Like, all of the parts are important, and you need to learn to not judge the value of a part based on whether it's a star or not, because it has nothing to do with it. And if the job of the part is to sit in the background or to sort of fill in the mix, or to, be a high part because most of your instruments are very mid-heavy or lower instruments, then that's what its job is, which sort of fits into this third question, which is, where does this part fit into the arrangement? Is it in the forefront? Is it in the background? Is it filler? Which filler is what I call a part that, like, you don't notice it, but it's there. Because usually if you're listening to a song right now, or if you were listening to a song earlier, you probably noticed 3 or 4 parts. You noticed the vocal, you might have noticed the drums, and maybe you did notice the bass, even if you don't really know the part, but you noticed it was there probably. And then you noticed a lead guitar or maybe another guitar. But guess what? There's a lot more instruments in there that you didn't even notice. Like, there might be 10 guitars in there, but you only noticed 2 of them. And filler is sort of what that other stuff is. It's just sort of fills in the mix and makes it shine a little bit more, makes it feel more full, even if you don't notice them. And then, obviously there's lead parts, which lead parts are the type of thing that I like to think of a lead part as something that somebody might sing in the shower or hum in the shower, right? A lead guitar part it's very melodic usually, lead vocal, obviously. And so for where does this part fill in the arrangement is the question we're on. And besides that, we also have pitch ranges, right? Like, you can't have all the instruments in the mid, because then it's just going to sound muddy and they're all going to clash. And you have to think of it like a chart. Think of it like a chart where you have pan, which, if you don't know what pan is basically, left speaker, right speaker. So pan left to right, which is anywhere from center to all the way on your right, all the way on your left. And then up and down on this chart is how high the instrument is in the pitch spectrum. Is it in like the 6th octave or the 7th or 8th octave? Or is it very much a bass part in that 2nd octave? Or 3rd or 1st, maybe even. And that's a part of where does this part fit, because you can't have everything in the mids, you can't have everything in the highs, or you can, but usually not a good idea. And you need to sort of spread it out. Like, maybe think to yourself, oh, well, I already have an acoustic guitar part, which is probably pretty mid. I have a piano part pretty mid, and I have a electric guitar part that's pretty mid, and my vocal's pretty mid. Oh, I need a higher part. I need something to sort of fill in the top end of the mix. And it's important to think in that way, where sometimes I even almost lay it out like, okay, this octave already has 1 or 2 parts. And then, an octave 3 octaves higher has a part, and one lower and 2 lower has a part. But then there's 2 octaves in between there that's above what I'm looking at right now, but is below that 3 octaves higher part. And I should fill those in a little bit. Not that you need something in every octave. That goes into whether you decide, how dense or sparse you want the mix, which we'll get into in a little bit. But it's important to be thinking about this. You don't want everything to be in the same pitch range. And similarly, there can be parts that are a little more rhythmic, where they're playing notes in a rhythm way, or soundscape. A soundscape can be so far as, like, literally it's just a synth that's held for the whole song that sort of just is there, right? Because then there's no rhythm whatsoever. It's just a drone, really. Or an electric guitar that's sort of just you pick it every quarter note, or every so fast that you can't even a 16th note or something, so fast, and with the delay that's on it and everything, it sort of just feels like a constant hum. Or something very rhythmic. And then high or low energy. There might be a part that sort of adds energy to the song, and then there might be a part that sort of just sits there and kind of is calming. And And all of this fits into that question of where does this part fit into the arrangement? Is this something that's meant to calm the arrangement a little bit? Is it something that's meant to increase the energy? Where does it fit in the pitch spectrum? Is it a high part to sort of add a little more excitement in the top end of the mix? What is it? And then question number 4 is when should each part come in? And the general rule of thumb here is usually want to give something new for the listener to hear every 4 measures or so, and definitely every 8 measures for sure. And you don't necessarily, there's different ways to change things up every 4 measures. Sometimes it might be changing up how you sing the melody a little bit. Maybe it's adding an extra instrument. Sometimes it's just changing what an instrument's doing. For the first part of a verse, you might have the electric guitar doing one thing, and then the electric guitar sort of changes after 4 measures. And so the 4 measure thing is really just a good rule of thumb of like, if you're wondering like, I feel like I got bored during the second verse for some reason. I wonder why. Something to look at is, did you give a little something new? It doesn't have to be a big thing, right? It can be super subtle. It might not even be something that anybody would ever pick out, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not important, because sometimes we subconsciously notice like, something changed to make me still interested. I don't know what it is, but it's there. And sometimes looking at that 4 measure rule can sort of help you with that. And also for asking when each part should come in, it's an important question for building a song, right? So building energy and making it feel like a bigger song, or reducing the energy and sort of calming down and being a little more intimate, if you will. And it can help with changes in tone too. Like maybe, the first verse and the third verse are going to have the same melody and the same chords probably. But you can very much change the tone of the first and third verse just by maybe changing the instrumentation of them, and maybe not even that, just changing the type of parts that are played. Maybe in the first verse there was a lot of excitement in the guitar parts, but then by the third one it's sort of lazy and just sort of very atmospheric. And little changes like that can make a huge difference. And understanding when each part should come in, like maybe if there was a lot of excitement in the first verse, but the third verse is very pensive and something horrible's happened, and it really, or maybe you're just really, thinking deeply and musing at this point in the song, then it calls for a different arrangement. You don't want those excited sounding instruments. You want something that sounds maybe darker, or maybe just more pensive. And then the 5th and last question. So if you've noticed, I've done the why, what, where, when, and now how, but to go over again really fast, why is this instrument the right choice? What is the job of this part? Where does this part fit into the arrangement? When should each part come in? And then this 5th one is, how do I know when to stop? And that's an interesting question because it depends. All of these questions depend, but this one is very much song specific and your personal taste specific. Maybe you like sparse arrangements that, is basically just a guy with his guitar singing, or, a girl at the piano with also a cello, and, maybe a little bit of synth filler in there, but largely very sparse. Or maybe, if you're anything like me, and sometimes you try to do a sparse arrangement, but still end up just layering in guitars and other stuff because you're so obsessed with like sort of the epic build and the emotive melodies and growing and then coming back down and changing the energy. And so I very much tend towards dense arrangements personally. Even sometimes I just can't help it, but knowing when to stop is a very sort of personal question, and then something that is a question of what the song demands. So for a lot of the music I write, it does tend to have large leaps in energy. Like the pitch range that I'm singing my verses in versus choruses is usually quite large. I would not say most of my songs I give zero craps about their singability, if you will. I don't write a song that somebody, if they were, if it was on the radio, I don't write a song that is like, oh, I want everybody to be able to sing along. Like most normal, non-singers would have to, go down the octave, and I don't really think about the singability per se, but the point of that is that for me, dense tends to be the right choice for the type of emotions I'm going for, which is usually building to something really large and sort of epic feeling in the choruses and sometimes the bridge, and the verses are usually more pensive. So that's where there's a little bit more of a sparse arrangement, and there's just a lot of taste here, and the key to sparse really is usually fewer instruments, and then sort of maybe more of a pitch range with instruments. Like a very sparse arrangement example might be a piano, which is usually very mid, and your voice, which is also usually going to be pretty mid, depending. Usually a little less mid if it's a female singer. And a violin, for example, that might be a couple octaves higher. And then maybe a bass part, which is, an octave or two lower. And then that's it. It's pretty sparse. There's a lot of space in between the instruments compared to, a rock song, which might have 6 guitars all in the like mids. And then, another 6 guitars, 1 octave higher in the next 2 octaves. And that's just that last thing to think about is at what point are you done? And I think you're done when with the mix, you can keep the listener engaged and interested throughout the whole song. Because really the purpose of arrangement is to give the song sort of some body, give it, if it needs to be filled out, if it needs to, if your chorus needs that bigger feel and, just you sitting at a piano won't quite do it. Like that's sort of the job of arrangement, is to fill in the gaps, to fill in those little emotions, to keep the interest. And those are sort of the things that you need to think about when you're arranging. Thanks for listening to the Songwriter Theory podcast. Be sure to subscribe and tell a friend. If you want to jumpstart your songwriting, be sure to download my free guide on 10 proven ways to start writing a song at songwritertheory.com/free guide.